All right, so the issue of circumcision has been an issue probably for a lot longer than you may realize. Filmmaker Brendon Marotta is with us, and he has a documentary called American Circumcision. So, Brendon, let me just respond to this first of all. I think there are a lot of people who are coming to realize, how do we act so horrified when we hear about African countries or Muslim-majority countries that practice female genital mutilation? How do we act so above that when millions of genital mutilations are performed on baby boys every year in this country?
It's funny you ask that because I interview several circumcised women in the film, and they all make the same comparison. They say that male genital cutting is basically the same and comparable to female genital cutting.
It's a part of it's a part of the genitals where there's a lot of sensation. Is that one of the comparisons?
Yes, and that's what all the research shows, is that the foreskin is the most erogenous zone of a man's body. And there's also the comparison of pain, that it is just as painful to a male child as it is to a female child. And there's the comparison of human rights, that you have the right to your own body, that women have been saying a long time, my body, my choice. And now many men are starting to say the same thing, that, wait a minute, this was a choice that was made for me, that was actually part of my body, and I had the right to make my own choice about that.
One of the differences that I see it is that the female circumcision or female genital mutilation, however you want to call it, is done later in life. The male circumcision is typically, not always, but typically done within the first few weeks.
That is one difference, but that's largely cultural. It's it's still the same tissue being amputated. And in some ways, an infant's psychological defenses are much lower than an adult's. The trauma of that sort of pain actually goes deeper in some way for an infant.
But a lot of people would say, and men would say, well, I don't remember it, so I don't remember any pain. And you know what? I'm glad I've had it done.
Right. I've heard that before, and it's one of those things where I wouldn't want to tell anyone how they should feel about their own body. And if you don't have a negative feeling toward it, that's fine, but there's a lot of men who do. And there's also the fact that, even though you may not have a conscious memory of it, the things that happen to us early in life do affect us later on. There is research that shows that there is a chemical change in infants' brains that doesn't go away. There's actually a higher rate of cortisol levels, the stress hormone, throughout life. So there are effects that you may not be aware of that go throughout that person's life. And then there's just also the fact that most men who are intact, who have the full body they were born with, are fine with that as well and would be horrified to lose that part of their body.
All right, so there are two objections that I could see coming up. One of them is faith-based, and that is that this has been a cultural practice of the Hebrew people going back to antiquity. And if the idea is you're going to say you're not allowed to perform a circumcision on a juvenile, that's going to open a whole religious can of worms.
Right.
I'm sorry for the imagery of the can of worms there. I don't know if anybody, I didn't mean to do that, but whatever.
It's all right. Yeah, that's an issue that comes up frequently. And in our film, a quarter of the cast is Jewish, and there are a lot of Jewish people who say, this was my body and I had the right to make my own decision. When you talk about religious freedom is something that you have the right to make, your own choices about. You have the right to decide what you believe. And if you carve a religious practice into a child, you're making that decision for them.
I think the Jewish requirement is it has to be done within a certain number of days, though. I mean,
right.
That's
in the Jewish religion, the requirement is at 8 days.
Wow.
And
I mean, it would be a little bit like, I'm being a little flip here, but not completely. It would be like saying, hey, we want to pass legislation that everybody has to try bacon before they turn 6. It's like, you know what I mean? People are going to say that is against our religion.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, you have to, let's say if a child was born Jewish but decides later on to change his faith, and maybe he wanted to keep that part of his body, that's another argument. It's like, well, I was born Jewish, but maybe I didn't want to stay Jewish, and maybe I wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the rate of circumcision among people who are born into Jewish households, especially observant Jewish households, is pretty close to 100%, I would imagine.
It's interesting how this debate is framed when it comes to Judaism, because in Islam, there's often a requirement for female circumcision as well.
Isn't there a requirement for male circumcision in Islam as well?
There is, yes.
Yeah.
If you look at countries like Egypt, for example, the rate for both men and women is nearly 90%. And in those cases, we say, well, the harm caused to the child, negates any practice that the parents may have. And we understand that women have the right to their own bodies, and that something like that, even if it was the parents' religion, would not be okay. Parents don't have the right to do things that might cause harm to their children, regardless of their religious belief. And there's actually been court cases around that in the case of, certain religious groups that refuse blood transfusions that would save a child's life, things like that.
Yeah.
In those cases, the courts have really clearly ruled that, no, we have to do what's in the best interest of the child.
Now, my other objection that I'm going to bring up is that we've talked about circumcision in the past, going back many years, and one of the things I hear from women is that they're grossed out by the uncircumcised penis, or that they would be less likely to have intercourse with a man who had an uncircumcised penis. This is all, just secondhand accounts. But I've heard that from women who've called into the show or told me that it's, they look gross.
Right. There's been sort of a cultural smear campaign against the natural male body. And if you go to cultures that don't practice circumcision, places like Europe and Asia, they see the natural male body as beautiful and think that, well, that's how men are, and of course we would accept someone, as they were born into the world. So, and it's interesting, again, when we talk about women's bodies, there's a very clear campaign against body shaming women in any way, that, all women are beautiful and that the way that women are naturally is perfectly fine. But when it comes to men's bodies, we actually shame the way that they come into the world naturally. And I find that that perception that there's somehow something wrong with that part of the body is really limited to American women who've not had any comparative experience. It's not like they've sampled, men from all over the world and decided, well, this is my preference. It's usually, I don't know what that is, so it must be weird. And I think that cultural perception is changing a lot, because now the circumcision rate is around 50%, maybe even lower. And so the women who are growing up today have, half of the men that they might date are intact. And so it doesn't seem as strange or weird a thing.
We're talking to filmmaker Brendon Marotta, whose documentary is called, or is it Marotta? I want to make sure I'm saying
Marotta.
It right. Marotta. Brendon Marotta has a documentary called American Circumcision. And where could this be seen?
You can find it online at circumcisionmovie.com. We actually already have a pre-order link on iTunes if you want to get a copy when it comes out August 31st.
I've got, and I didn't give out the phone line, but I guess if anyone wants to call in, because this is a divisive topic. It's been a divisive topic for a long time.
Yeah.
You get this started online, and
this morning
it'll go on forever, right?
And we had people already arguing in our YouTube chat about it, about pro and against.
So here's somebody who wrote in. They emailed in, so I'm just going to read it to you. So this is from a listener named Elsa, and she says, Buzz, male and female circumcision in some cultures is not the same. They actually grab the little girl's clitoris, I can say that, pull it up hard and as high as they can, and then clip it off. So it would be the equivalent of somebody cutting the head off a little boy's penis. So it's not the same. it's brutal, and as you can imagine, these little girls are deprived of any kind of sexual gratification as far as orgasms, and it's a visual mutilation as well. So we got this lady writing in who says they're not comparable, the two practices.
So part of the challenge with that is that when we talk about female circumcision, there's actually 4 different types of female circumcision. And the least invasive is just essentially a prick of that part of the body. And the most invasive is called infibulation, where they basically remove everything and then sew the woman shut. And it's quite awful.
What is the most common version of it, if you have any knowledge of that? Is there one that
invasive?
You said there were 4 different versions of female circumcision. I wondered if there was one that was more common in countries that practice that.
It ranges. The most invasive kind, I believe, is limited to really specific cultures like Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed someone in the film who went through that, and she has an incredibly powerful story. But the type that is more common is really actually very comparable to male circumcision, which is the removal of the clitoral hood, the part that is analogous to the foreskin in women. And the American Academy of Pediatrics actually released a policy statement at one point saying that that type of female circumcision was far less invasive than male circumcision. And in their case, they were actually arguing that people should be allowed to do this type of female circumcision in the America.
Okay, I want to make sure that our
outcry against them for that.
I want to make sure our listeners are clear on this, Brendon. You're not comparing female mutilation in any of its forms favorably to male circumcision.
No,
you don't
not.
think that any version of the female circumcision is
male or female
is a good thing.
Right, and in America, most people are absolutely against circumcision when it comes to women. And they're all very clear that women have the right to their own bodies, and that any removal of any part of a woman's body without her consent is a huge violation of human rights. But when you start talking about applying the same standard to men, that's when people, get very heated in their debate. And I think that it's not an issue of competitive suffering. It's not like there's, at some point that we have to decide who suffers more, is it men or women. I think that the human rights violation occurs, in the arguments that people make against circumcision. The violation occurs the moment you start removing any part of someone's body. And it doesn't matter how much you remove. The idea is that person has the right to their own body.
This is Brendon Marotta. And do you have a minute, Brendon? I've got a break, but I'd like to continue if you're able to do that. I don't know how long you've set aside for us today. All right, and let me give out the phone number. Toll-free studio line is 844-305-6210. That's 844-305-6210. And we'll come back. One of the arguments for circumcision, and I'm just going to leave it dangling out there, as it were, is that it's more hygienic. Cut this part off, and there's no way that part will get as dirty, I guess is the logic. But that'll be the first thing I want you to answer, and then maybe we'll get some phone calls when we come back, Brendon.
Absolutely.
Just hang on a second. The film is called American Circumcision. More with Brendon on the way right after this. All right, we're back with filmmaker Brendon Marotta, who has a documentary called American Circumcision about the growing movement, and I agree that it is growing, people who don't see the sense in circumcising, and in fact see it as a human rights violation to circumcise a baby boy without their consent. Brendon, were you a filmmaker who got interested in this documentary, or were you an anti-circumcision activist who felt so passionately that you made a film about it? So which are you?
I was a filmmaker first and foremost. I've been making movies since I was 14. I went to film school. I went out to L.A. and was working on horror films and documentary stuff out there, and sort of stumbled across the subject matter and felt so moved by what I was learning and so surprised how little of it was known by the general public that I felt like I had to turn that into a film.
What was it that spoke to you that much about this topic?
I think one of the things I learned that really opened my eyes was the fact that up until the late 1980s, doctors believed that infants did not feel pain and would do the procedure without any anesthetic or painkillers of any kind. And that really shocked me. I mean, you can imagine an infant being held down and having part of his body cut off, feeling all of it with no painkillers of any kind. Many activists have told me that seeing footage of that and hearing the screams of these children is what made them want to change this issue. So that was one of the first things that I learned that, really shocked me and made me think, okay, maybe there's more to this issue than I've heard before.
Well, there are plenty of guys who aren't comfortable talking about their dong situation, but I'm not one of those, so I'll just let you know. I guess I was circumcised as a baby, and I don't have any memory of it. I guess the more I'm hearing about it, maybe sex is way more awesome than I can ever imagine it is. Well, because I don't have that extra, attachment of flesh, I guess.
Well, one of the things that I learned that made it, because I think I had the same resistance that a lot of people have of, well, there's nothing I can do about that now, so, why hear about it? Out of sight, out of mind. And one of the early things I learned about was something called foreskin restoration, which is a bit of a misnomer because you can't get everything back. The nerve endings that are removed are gone.
I think I've heard of this. You stretch it like it's a stretching thing that you can do at home.
So they take the remaining skin and they stretch it over time. The same way you might put like a gauge in your ear and expand it until that skin covers the head of the penis and you get back the covering of the head of the glands and some of the gliding motion of the foreskin. And there's one guy that we interview who makes devices that people use to do this. And by the way, it's sort of a funny sequence in the film because there's all these sort of strange contraptions that men are hanging from the end of their penis in order to regrow this part of the body. But one of the things he says is he had a client who couldn't have children because he actually didn't have the sensitivity to finish inside of his wife. And after restoring, he regained enough sensitivity that he was able to. He actually had a child and named it after the guy who sold him this restoration device. Wow. So there's a significant difference there, and there is the capacity to get some of it back. There's also some efforts to use things like regenerative medicine to regrow that part of the body. So people have regrown limbs and organs using stem cells and regenerative medicine. And there's actually a company called Orgen that is trying to do the same thing with the foreskin. Now, at present, that's farther in the future. The technology for that does not exist yet. But the fact that people are even trying to do that should show how many men are interested in regaining this part of the body.
We had a caller. The caller didn't want to didn't want to talk on the air. But Joanna, you talked to the caller. What was the reason given for not wanting to go on the air?
She didn't want anyone to recognize her voice.
Okay, so why don't you just give us the gist of it then?
She says that she's had both men who've been circumcised and men who haven't been circumcised, and she prefers a man who is not circumcised.
Does she? Oh, she prefers not circumcised.
Yeah, she said it was more pleasurable for her.
Okay.
I've actually heard that from several women. The reason being that when you remove the foreskin, the glands dries out and becomes keratinized. It's similar to like your elbow. If you feel your elbow, that skin is probably rougher than the rest of your body because it's being rubbed against things. And, it's the same way that people develop calluses on their hands from working with their hands a lot. And so if you have a covering there, it's smoother and it doesn't roughly abrade the inside of a woman.
Is there a medical consensus? I mean, doctors typically do, unless you're Jewish, and then there's a ceremony with what's called a moil is how you do it. But in hospitals, are there doctors who are not doing it? Or is it something that less doctors are willing to do maybe than 20 or 30 years ago?
If you talk to doctors outside the United States, the consensus is that circumcision is mutilation and harmful and should not be practiced routinely. Doctors in Norway, there's been several who've refused to do the procedure. both Denmark and Iceland are talking about banning the procedure. But in the United States, there's sort of a mix. There's a lot of physicians who are what's called conscientious objectors. So physicians have the right to refuse to do procedures that they feel are not ethical. Things, there are and that's very common around something like abortion, but around circumcision, it's also quite present. And even among medical groups, there is debate. And part of the challenge around that comes from the fact that in America, doctors have a profit motive to continue doing circumcision, so they get paid for it. And there's also the risk of liability if they say that it's wrong. So if they say, oh, this thing we've been doing for decades is actually harmful, then they open themselves up to lawsuit from everyone who feels that, wait a minute, you didn't tell me this was harmful.
I've got daughters, so I don't know how this is done. Maybe you could tell me. Is it typically done before the baby goes home from the hospital? Do they come? Is it a hospital setting? So it's done. It's part of the package that you get whenever you have a baby in a hospital. If you choose it, yeah.
And it's often done by OBs, by doctors of women's health. So the person who is doing this procedure is often not really trained in the knowledge of what it is they're cutting off or what they're doing. And when I spoke to the head of the Virginia Urological Association, one of the things that he told me is that maybe 10% of the boys who come through his practice have a botch of some form. Because, again, it's often the lowest person on the totem pole at a hospital that's doing this. It's an intern. So, botches are actually a lot more common than people realize.
What are you saying? What's the word you're saying?
A botch, like a botch.
Oh, a botch.
Yeah.
As in when they do the procedure wrong and it causes an error of some kind. They take off more skin on one side than the other. They leave a skin tag of some kind. I mean, I even know people who are involved in this issue who have a chunk missing from the head of their penis. So it's a lot more common than people realize.
All right. So you wouldn't argue against somebody who's an adult and for whatever reason, if they wanted to have a circumcision, you would say that that's, because body modification is
and I don't think that anyone involved in the intactivist movement, the movement to, keep children intact, would have a problem with that at all. If you're an adult, you can make whatever decision that you want about your body. It's your right. The debate is over whether or not people have the right to make these decisions and force them on non-consenting minors.
What would intactivists like to see? Legislation making it illegal to perform circumcision on minors? Anybody under the age of, I guess, 18? Whatever. I don't know what the age of consent for having that kind of thing done. I would imagine probably the same age that you decide to get a tattoo, and you're able to do that without parents' permission.
Right. The argument they make is that the age of consent for everything else should be the age of consent for permanent life-altering surgery. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly been talk of legislation of some kind, but I think that before that happens, there has to be a shift in people's thinking about this issue and about the male body and about the value of the foreskin.
So I thought growing up that it was just something, it's just something we do in America and we've always done it. But then I was told, and you would know better than I, that it really doesn't go back that far. If you were to go back not even 100 years, it was very uncommon for a non-Jew boy to have a circumcision, that it was much more common for, other than in the Jewish community, it was much more common not to have a circumcision.
Right. Circumcision began as a medical practice in the late 1800s, in the Victorian era, as a cure for masturbation. The Victorians thought that masturbation was the cause of a great many social and moral ills.
Well, let me tell you something, and let me tell the Victorians 120 years ago, it didn't work. Because I had the procedure, and it didn't stop me one bit.
But that was the thinking at the time. And actually, you brought up the idea of hygiene earlier.
Yes.
In that era, they were not just talking about hygiene of germs or anything like that. They were talking about moral hygiene. Mm-hmm. And so, interestingly, that myth has filtered down, over the course of many years and changed and morphed a bit, because now we see sexuality as a positive. We think that sexual pleasure and sensation is a good thing and that people should have as much of it as they want. But
I
at the
think
time, that was seen as a very negative thing.
Not the moral hygiene as much, but I think the hygiene is a case that is probably still being made today, maybe even by some medical professionals, that it's easier to keep clean if it's circumcised, that it's more prone to infections if it's not circumcised. You know what I'm talking about, Brendon, right?
Right. So when I spoke to a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, who's on their latest circumcision policy statement, which is a pro-circumcision policy statement. This is someone who believes the practice should be allowed to continue. He acknowledged that the hygiene thing is a complete myth. You know, we have soap and water now. You don't need to cut body parts off to clean them. You wouldn't, cut off your ear to avoid ear infections or cut out your eye to avoid eye infections. It's sort of an absurd thing. Mm-hmm. And if you go into the infections, claims around circumcision, many of them are really dubious. So the foreskin is actually, when you're a child, fused to the head of the glands, kind of like how your fingernail is fused to your finger. And they used to tell parents that you need to pull that back and clean under there. And in reality, you actually need to leave that structure alone until the child is able to retract it himself. And, the same way if you were to pull off your fingernail to try to clean under there, you'd have massive problems. Mm-hmm. If you pull back and forcibly retract the foreskin prematurely, you also have problems. So I think that many of the claims that the foreskin is prone to infection come from the fact that doctors don't actually know how to care for the intact foreskin. They haven't seen one in a long time. They're not trained around it. And in fact, the training they're given is actually going to cause more infections than just leaving it alone would. So that's actually important if you're a parent to know, if you're a parent of a child who's intact, that you don't need to retract the foreskin. And that, many times if you bring your child to a doctor, they will do what's called forcible retraction, which is harmful to the child.
Brendon, I got to take a break, but I just want to let everybody know that your documentary is called American Circumcision. And just one other thing I want to know, are you able to draw any conclusions, like who is the most resistant, like who's the most pro-circumcision? My guess would be, boy.
You don't even know.
Right. I see it more as like a progressive, like not circumcising your boys is something maybe I would see from higher educated, more progressive people. It seems like it would be a hard sell to evangelical Christians, for instance.
I think that the commonality between people who choose not to circumcise their child is a willingness to think for themselves. Mm. And the thing that I noticed the most resistance around this issue from is people who have a profit motive for pushing circumcision, or people who have a strong cultural or religious attachment to it. Right. And part of the challenge of this issue is that it hits on all the most personal things. It's sex and politics and religion all in the most personal way possible. And people make a strong identity attachment to this issue.
All right. Brendon, once again, we could get the movie American Circumcision. How can it be seen?
You can find it on circumcisionmovie.com, and you can pre-order on iTunes now. It'll be out August 31st.
All right. Thank you, Brendon.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you.
All right.